When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject, one last time. User, SentLL254. Posted, September 16th, 1996.
Unless you're particularly unlucky, you'll go through your childhood with death as, at most, something for Kojak to investigate in between beer commercials. You understand it as an abstract concept, but can't conceive of how it relates to your own life. The days themselves feel endless, so the people and things who populate them must be the same. When my dog Roddy got hit by a car, my folks explained it in such a roundabout way that I thought he had quite literally been sent off, as if he was going to dog jail for some inexplicable crime against the Ford Motor Car Company. Over time, I slowly stopped asking when Roddy was coming back, and my parents were careful to avoid mentioning his name. Eventually, I came to accept he was gone, even if his total non-existence was never a concept I engaged with. My parents turned out to be as bad at being married as they were at grief counseling, and divorced when I was 7, my dad moving out to parts unknown. He had been such a son of a bitch to all of us that this, in and of itself, this wasn't exactly bad news. However, with Mom having to work even more to keep up with bills, I began spending long stretches of my day home alone. From my point of view, being a latchkey kid came with benefits like unlimited TV time and the ability to power eat whatever snacks happened to be squirreled away in the cupboards, but Mom felt guilty. After a couple months of me having run of the house, she reached out to her mother, Rose. Up until this point, Grandma Rose hadn't been a part of our day-to-day lives. My own relationship with her was limited to phone calls on holidays and a present on every birthday. Part of the reason for this was because she lived 350 miles away in Lubbock in a big fancy apartment building called Park Towers. The other, larger reason we didn't see much of each other was because she absolutely hated my father. This wasn't entirely based on the fact he'd nearly gotten us killed by falling asleep at the wheel on our one and only drive to visit her, but it didn't hurt. From what I've gathered as an adult, the marriage created a rift between her and my mother, and with the divorce, they were able to start mending it. Grandma Rose arrived on a Saturday, her pistachio Mercury Marquis practically glowing in the afternoon sun. My memories of her were limited to a single hazy image in which she was standing at the top of an apartment stairwell, so I was cautious about approaching the short, circular, hard-faced woman who heaved herself out of that big green boat. When she saw my hesitation, she seemed to intuitively understand and gave me a big, bright smile, then said, "We're going to be friends, you and I." And we were. For almost every weekday over the next 6 years, Grandma Rose was there when I woke up in the morning, and she was there when I came home from school. Despite being a truly awful cook, she made sure I had dinner every night and tried to teach me the basics of cooking, at least as she understood them. Though she wasn't what you'd consider a highly educated woman, she knew a lot about the world, and did her best to impart that knowledge to me. Things like keeping your hands to yourself, judging people by their actions rather than their appearance, and never trusting anyone who is trying to sell you something. The last time I saw her was a Thursday in the fall. Mom had finished work early enough it was still daylight outside when she went to drive Grandma home. It was such an unremarkable afternoon. I remember almost nothing about it except for her putting on a white and purple jacket and talking about how she was looking forward to bowling later on. She wasn't there when I woke up the following morning, nor was she there when I got home that afternoon. Instead, Mom was waiting for me at the kitchen table, chain smoking and crying. She told me that Grandma Rose was dead. She had always had problems with her digestion and had blamed that for the chest pain she felt at bowling the night before, according to Mom. Unfortunately, it had actually been a heart attack, and when her symptoms worsened in the early hours of the morning, an ambulance had taken her to Plano General. She'd passed away while I was still asleep in my bed, and I'd had no idea. The thought of it left me numb. That numbness persisted for the next week as Mom's friends and out-of-town family members came to pay their respects. Relations I'd barely heard of, let alone met, filled up our living room and kitchen, telling old family stories and smoking till the air turned blue. I sat there, breathing in the fog of 1,000 cigarettes until it made me nauseous, after which I retreated to my room. It was above the kitchen, so I could still hear the combined voices through the vents, and that made it all easier to deal with somehow. I ended up spending a lot of time there in the weeks and months that followed. It was almost 2 weeks before the reality of her death truly sunk in, and I cried for her. By then, it was December, and everyone had gone back to their lives, the mourning over, or at least the collective part of it. I found my own grief in the loneliness that followed. My entire world had been destabilized by the knowledge people could, at any point, simply step out of your life and never come back. Alongside that fear and grief burned an anger that we'd never had a chance to say goodbye, not really. Not in the way people should when they know it's the last time. I don't know when the dreams started, but they were always the same. I'd be up in my room, listening to music, when I heard Grandma Rose's voice through the vent, as if she was standing in the kitchen. Each time I'd jump to my feet and run down the stairs, my legs pumping as fast as they could, yet it was never fast enough. By the time I stepped into the kitchen, she was gone, and I'd wake up with a sob caught in my chest. This repeated itself at least once a week, sometimes more, for what had to be a month. Instead of the cumulative disappointments hardening me against the dreams, they made it worse, so that the heartache of bursting into the empty kitchen was amplified by the number of times that had come before. It reached a point where I stopped responding. Her voice would drift up from the vent, and instead of rushing downstairs, I'd stay right where I was, waiting out the remainder of the dream. Her voice would inevitably fade, and then I'd wake up. Each time my eyes opened, the knot of grief I carried in my chest seemed to cinch itself a little tighter. In early February, I had the dream one last time. Everything was the same as it had ever been, the music playing, the winter sunlight shining through my window. Then, as always, Grandma Rose's voice began to echo up from below, and I steeled myself against it, waiting for the inevitable fade. Except this time, it didn't fade. It became clearer. The hope that had long been snuffed out rose up in me again, and I couldn't stop myself from taking slow, measured strides down the upstairs hallway. When I got to the stairwell, I paused, listening. She was still down there. All restraint was out the window, and I barreled downstairs, racing through the empty living room into a well-lit kitchen where my grandmother was waiting for me. I don't remember what she looked like or what was said, because all that mattered was that she was there. I wrapped my arms tight around her, and she did the same to me. It felt as though we were both bathed in the purest light I'd ever known, and it made me realize we'd never truly been that far apart and never would be. That loneliness was the equivalent of walking around your house when the power was out. You were still at home, you just couldn't find your way for a little while. When I woke, the knot in my chest was gone. As I got ready for school, it occurred to me that for the first time since finding out about Grandma Rose's death, I didn't feel as if I was standing outside my body, watching myself go about the day. I was back in control of my life and excited to see what else it would bring.
Subject: The Last Song. User: KH55. Posted October 3rd, 1998.
Sometimes to do what I do, you need to be underhanded. Because the business is nominally connected to American history and folklore, there are members of the trade who try to justify the throats they cut by saying it's ultimately in the name of cultural preservation, but that's bullshit, and deep down, they know it. Whether you're being paid to help destabilize a South American government for the CIA or steal original recordings of folk songs for a wealthy private collector, a mercenary is a mercenary. We all do what's necessary to get the job done, and consequently, we know more than most about how things run down in the engine room of the world. Whether we want to or not, we know. For all the fanfare the Cloak and Dagger set gets about their commitment to secrecy, I'd bet a month's worth of commissions that a hell of a lot more civilians know about the inner workings of Cold War espionage than are even aware that my job exists. What exactly do I do? I drive back and forth across the United States trying to find regional folk singers performing rare variation of folk tunes, or in some cases, songs that have all but disappeared from the historical record, and I record them. Then I take those recordings and sell them to one of a handful of those wealthy private collectors I mentioned before. They range from West Coast new money to East Coast old, with a dusting of overseas players whose fortunes I wouldn't even want to guess at the provenance of. Why would people pay fortunes for a recording of some old bluesman croaking out a song his grandmother taught him while working out in the fields as a boy? Because once you achieve a certain level of wealth, you start to feel like you own the future, so all that remains is to start grabbing up the past. Some of these old tunes are historiographical in nature too, which is to say they describe real events that were never recorded in any other way. If you own that recording, you now have a little piece of history all to yourself. I can't even begin to tell you how many territorial battles, small-scale natural disasters, and murders only exist on a piece of acetate in a vault somewhere. Then, there are the stranger stories, the ones that are too fantastical to be real but still get passed down like history. You don't get those often, but they're out there. For example, 3 months ago, I paid a half-blind 78-year-old Alabama guitarist named Lee Tom Hickok to play me The Tremblin' Man. We were in Caperton Cemetery near Pump Spring Branch, and he sang about a kind of medicine man, a hand trembler who was summoned to the town of Boyd to identify the demon possessing a little boy. According to the story, the hand trembler tried 3 different times across 3 different days to name the demon so it could then be exorcised from the child, and each time, The demon replies, "Trembler, trembler, don't waste your time. Done told you once that this boy's mine. A deal was struck, now the price be paid, or pucks will come and widows made." The prophecy comes true when they succeed in removing the presence from the child, and within 6 weeks the Spanish flu, which Boyd's natural geographical boundaries had managed to keep at bay, ripped through the village, killing everyone. Nowadays, Boyd is a ghost town along the river, overgrown and forgotten, and as best as I could find, Hickok's song is the only surviving record it ever existed at all. Who passed the story along if everyone in Boyd died? The secret answer there is it's probably bullshit, and the flu ripped through Boyd because that's what it did everywhere. But I've got one client in particular, one of the overseas ones, who eats this stuff up. So I found the bluesman who let me record the song for $200 and a bottle of Thunderbird. That client is also rabid about exclusivity and pays well for the privilege, so I laced the wine with codeine and wouldn't let him drink until the performance was over. Hickok wasn't a bad guy, and we sat there together on 2 weather-beaten headstones shooting the breeze for a while until the poison took hold. He was dead before I finished packing up my recorder. I dumped the rest of the wine in the creek and left the bottle next to him. His $200 went into the poor box of a church in Stevenson. For spec jobs, where I find the song first and then a buyer, the next step would be getting to a payphone and calling Milo, my broker. He listens to the song, takes notes, then reaches out to the usual suspects to see who's interested. When the dust settles, my fee is wired to me and the recording is sent via private courier to a Dropbox in Cincinnati, at which point my involvement ends. For the client who likes unusual stuff, it's different. Instead of Milo, I call a number with a 476 area code, then hang up. 5 to 10 minutes later, the payphone will ring and the client's representative, a man called Gordon, will be on the other end. Gordon will listen to the tape and say either yes or no. If he says no, then I start the process over again with Milo. If he says yes, though, then I hang up, and no matter where I am, I start driving in the direction of Bowling Green, Kentucky to make the delivery in person. This time, I wanted to put some distance between myself and Hickok's body before reaching out to the client, so I drove the hour to the shopping mall just off I-75 in Chattanooga. The call was unusual in that Gordon agreed to purchase the song without hearing it for twice my usual fee, provided I came to his client's estate immediately after hanging up. Upon my arrival, Gordon said, there'd be an offer of additional work. I looked up at the neon clock hanging above the mall's food court. It was almost 7 p.m., which meant I wouldn't get to Bowling Green until 11. It was a long day, but for what amounted to 6 months' worth of pay, I could handle it. I told Gordon I was on my way. The client's estate sits on several acres of woodland northwest of the city, encircled by a 7-foot granite wall. The stone is roughly hewn, mortared together in such a way as to give the impression of a castle's fortifications, topped with a narrow band of magnetite. The only way inside is through a heavy, wrought iron gate, open remotely once security staff have vetted you over the intercom. The driveway is perfectly smooth black asphalt, arcing out through a well-maintained lawn until it reaches the main house, which is as imposing and confounding as everything else about the property. A brilliant white dome rising up out of the earth, its upper half covered in opaque glass. I'd never seen the property at night, but as I made my way up the driveway, the blaze of light coming from those windows gave the house the appearance of a gigantic eyeball staring skyward. An unexpected chill ran through me. The lateness of the hour wasn't the only thing out of the ordinary. The rectangular parking area adjacent to the house, usually empty when I visited, was almost full of high-end black sedans, BMW next to Jaguar, next to Mercedes-Benz, next to brands with badging I didn't even recognize. Even Gordon's man, an unflappable, tall, blue-eyed bodybuilder type named Kohler, whom he called his attaché, seemed out of sorts when he met me at the door. His black suit jacket was creased, and when he leaned forward to take the recording, one side fell open to reveal heavy sweat stains at the armpit and an empty shoulder holster. "Mr. Gordon will see you in the library," he said, his eyes scanning the landscape behind me. "Please follow me." Inside, the people who belonged to the cars in the lot weren't within sight, but you could hear murmuring from somewhere nearby, and more than that, you could feel them. Tension ran through the air like a current. The decor was unchanged, stark white walls and heavy antique furniture, primarily in the walnuts and oaks you'd expect from the German Renaissance. On those stark white walls hung artwork I've always been intrigued and repelled by in equal measure. They depicted nightmarish landscapes bathed in deep red light and ruled over by subhuman creatures who all but defied description. Each room had at least one of these paintings. Most had several, and the cumulative effect wasn't unlike sitting in a guard tower, staring at the feeds from a battery of security cameras. One of the walls was dotted with tiny divots, from which spiderwebbed narrow cracks. I'm not a gun guy, but even I knew they were bullet holes. Before my chaperone could usher me into the next room, I saw black smudges leading away from the damaged wall around a corner. It took a second to put two and two together, but once I had, I swiveled my head away as quickly as possible. The less I knew, the better. When I entered the library, Gordon was sitting at the long table in the center of the room. He was as calm as Kohler was rattled. Wispy hair neatly combed into place, his tiny spectacles polished to a high shine. He stood to greet me and we shook hands, his grip cold and firm. "Mr. Herman, thank you for coming." I nodded. "Of course, you and your employer are valuable clients. I'm happy to serve." Gordon gave a tight smile. "And the financial incentive did not hurt, I imagine." He waved to Kohler, who was still standing at the library door, balancing on the balls of his feet. He saw the movement, but it took several seconds for him to register what it meant. He frowned. "Are you sure, Herr Gordon?" I'd never before heard him question an order from his boss, and neither had Gordon, judging by the look of annoyance on his face. He snapped a reply in German too fast for me to catch, and Kohler blanched. He left the room quickly, closing the door softly behind him. This was so unlike my previous visits, which had moved with a clockwork-like professionalism, that my discomfort deepened. I may not question where clients made their money, but I'm no fool either. And the last thing I needed was to see or hear something else I might have to testify about later. "Mr. Gordon," I said, "forgive me for asking, but perhaps it would be better if I came back tomorrow. I appear to have arrived at an inopportune time." His smile returned, and he gestured to a chair opposite where he was standing. "Not at all, Mr. Herman. Please, sit." I sat. Gordon crossed the room to the far wall, against which sat a large walnut chest. Like the furniture in the other rooms, it was a German Renaissance piece, easily 300 years old and covered with ornate marquetry in a dizzying geometric pattern. He produced a brass key from the pocket of his suit coat and unlocked the chest from the top. The lid opened soundlessly on well-maintained hinges, and Gordon pulled out a thick manila folder. Mr. Herman, what do you know about the settling of America? I thought about it for a moment. Our ancestors came from Europe and took the land by force. From the indigenous inhabitants who had been here before you mean? He nodded, almost to himself, as if confirming an internal thought. And do you believe those indigenous people to be the first to settle this land? That's what we were taught in school. I suppose I've never given it much more thought than that. And why would you? Gordon joined me at the table, taking the seat on the opposite side. He placed the folder between us. My client has long believed that these indigenous people were not in fact the land's original inhabitants. He firmly believed that the original settlers of this land were white men, Vikings who then returned home. He's expended a great deal of time, effort, and resources to explore this hypothesis. Indeed, some of the work you've done for us has been to that end. We had almost given up our search, but then, 18 months ago, one of our teams unearthed a structure in New England. Please, have a look. He gestured toward the folder between us. I flipped it open to see a stack of color photographs depicting what looked like archaeological digs. Crews of masked men in black coveralls standing next to earthen pits, carefully marked off into grid patterns. Several photos down, there was a series of shots featuring row upon row of standing stone triangles. In one, an anonymous worker stood next to them for scale. They were easily 2 feet taller than he was. This is like Stonehenge. Where did you find these? I couldn't keep the awe from my voice, and Gordon sounded pleased. In 2 separate locations, both small islands off the coast of Massachusetts. Point of fact, those stones and the complex they inhabit predate Stonehenge by millennia. Looked up at him. That changes everything we know about the history of the New World, possibly the Old One as well. Yes, Mr. Herman, it does. Then who made them? Naturally, we had hoped we would find evidence to confirm my employer's hypothesis. However, that was not to be the case. When we unsealed one of the chambers, we discovered a series of engravings with what we believe to be a written language. It took a team of linguists the better part of a year to decipher and translate what turned out to be a story. While we cannot be completely certain of the translation's accuracy, we've concluded that this story is in fact a history. I placed the folder back down on the table. Gordon looked more animated than I'd ever seen him. He was waiting for me to ask the question, so I indulged him. A history of what? He smiled brightly. The first people, Mr. Herman. They rose from the sea and conquered the known world. They were brilliant, savage, and unstoppable. Their reign lasted for thousands of years until, for reasons we do not yet understand, they relinquished control and simply returned to the sea. Before they did, however, they left us a gift. I began to feel uneasy, even more so than before. Another unasked question hung between us, but I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Sensing my reluctance, Gordon went ahead. The gift was a song. A song? Yes, we believe it was taught to the indigenous men and women of the region, the Nauset and the Wampanoag. It is, in a way, the last song. I don't understand. The sea people left us a way to call them back, Mr. Herman. A safety valve, you might call it. As I said, they appeared to have been quite brilliant, and they understood that one day, mankind may grow to a place where it required a firm hand to right itself, a master to help us get our house in order. My stomach turned to ice. And you want me to see if it's still out there? Yes, Mr. Herman. For the foreseeable future, this will be your full-time occupation. You are going to find the last song for us, and together, we will call forth our masters to remake the world. From outside the door, I could hear what sounded like Kohler crying.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.